Crows wheeled high above the air, their black wings casting strange, moving shadows on the white snow of the ironclad forest. A small Alaskan Malamute puppy shivered, lying on the ground, surrounded by sharp beaks and scrutinizing eyes. It had no strength left to run, no voice to call for help. But just as the first crow began its descent, fate intervened. An old man appeared, his gaze fixed on the helpless puppy. What happened next would change not only the dog's life but the man's as well. The winter morning was bleak. The sky was heavy and gray, and the wind whistled and moaned through the bare branches. Snow had fallen all night, blanketing the ground in a thick, white layer, undisturbed. Everything was eerily quiet, only the occasional crunch of packed snow or the brittle snap of ice-coated branches in the wind could be heard. Then, a sound broke the silence, a weak, pitiful whimpering. It was so faint, almost swallowed by the winter's cold arsenal, yet it was there, trembling with desperation. Near the gnarled roots of an old hemlock, half buried in the snow, lay a small Alaskan Malamute puppy. Its cream-colored, thick fur, meant to be healthy, was now matted and stiff with ice and mud. No more than 6 weeks old, the puppy was too small, too fragile, and unfit to be alone in this cold. Its large, dark brown eyes darted around, full of terror and confusion. Its weak legs twitched, as if trying to move, but its strength was gone. The surrounding snow was marred by tiny, frantic paw prints, telling the story of a desperate struggle for warmth before it finally collapsed. Above, perched on the twisted branches, was a flock of crows, their glossy black coats standing out against the pale landscape. Their dark eyes watched the helpless creature below, their claws gripping the bark, restlessly waiting. One crow gave a sharp cry, and others followed, the sound echoing in the frigid air. A single crow descended, spreading its wings to land on a nearby stump, tilting its head to peer curiously at the trembling puppy. A short distance away on a narrow, forest path, Elias Vance, a tall man, his back slightly bowed by age, walked with slow but steady steps. He was wrapped in a thick, worn woolen coat. His gray beard was roughly trimmed, and his sharp blue eyes held a quiet alertness. Deep lines were etched onto his weathered face, telling the story of a long life that had known both joy and sorrow. Elias had spent his later years alone in a small log cabin on the outskirts of his small town in the Cascade Mountains. He had once been a skilled cabinet maker, a man with strong hands and great patience, but life had taken its toll, leaving him solitary. His wife had passed, and his only son, the light of his life, met too early a death. Since then, Elias had retreated, preferring the silent company of nature to the illusions of men. This winter morning, he was out on his usual walk, his boots crunching on the fresh snow. It was less a routine and more a way to clear his head, to surrender to the silence. But as he drew near, a faint whimper reached his ears, making him pause. He frowned. It wasn't the sound of a wild animal, but something smaller, more helpless. Stepping off the path, Elias walked toward the sound, his steps cautious but certain. As he got closer, the scene unfolded, the small puppy, shivering, encircled by the crows. His brows knitted deeper. The little creature was barely moving, breathing weakly, its tiny body shaking violently. The birds sensed its weakness, observing, waiting. Elias let out a slow breath, feeling a familiar ache in his chest. He was not a man to interfere with the laws of nature. He had seen too much in the wilderness and had learned that some battles were not his. But the dog's eyes, when it looked at him, large and pleading, shook his resolve. This was not just lost, it was abandoned. He stepped forward, waving his hands to shoo the crows away. The birds flapped their wings in irritation, giving sharp cries before retreating to the higher branches, still watching. Elias knelt in the snow, studying the small being before him. The puppy let out a small whimper but did not move. "Where did you come from, little one?" he whispered, his voice rough from years of silence. As he got closer, he saw signs of neglect. Its fur was ragged, its ribs were visible, and around its neck, there was a faint scar where a collar might have been. Someone had abandoned it here, and by the look of it, not by accident. Elias sighed, rubbing his face. "No more stray dogs. I won't open my home to things I might not be able to care for," he told himself. But as he reached a hand out and scooped the small body up, he knew he couldn't leave. The puppy yelped in surprise at first, a weak moan, but offered no resistance. It was utterly exhausted. Elias felt its fragility, the almost non-existent weight as he held it. He pulled the puppy close to his chest, shielding it from the wind. "You won't survive here, that's for sure," he muttered, adjusting his hold. The crows began to cry sharply above them again, protesting the interruption of their dreadful watch. But Elias ignored them, turning back toward his log cabin. The snow began to fall again, and the wind picked up as the storm approached. Holding the small, trembling puppy close to his chest, he walked steadily forward, leaving the clearing and the waiting eyes of the crows behind him. Elias pushed open the heavy wooden door of his log cabin. The warmth of the burning hearth wrapped around him like a familiar embrace. Outside, the storm was approaching, the wind howling, and thick snow plastering the iced-over window panes. He stepped carefully inside, still holding the small, furry bundle in his arms, the quick, weak beat of the puppy's heart against his chest. His home was simple, built by his own sure hands decades ago, a place where family never came. The furniture was old but carefully kept, and the bookshelves held dusty novels, relics of a past when he cared about stories other than his own. Now, the only sounds filling the house were the creaking of old wood and the rhythmic tick-tock of the clock on the mantelpiece. He placed the puppy on a thick, woven rug near the fireplace and knelt beside it. The little creature immediately curled up, its small body still trembling despite the heat of the fire. Elias removed his heavy coat and draped it over the shivering animal, hoping the extra warmth would help. He reached for the metal pot on the cast iron stove in the corner and poured the leftover stew into a small bowl. It wasn't much, but it was warm, and a normal dog would eagerly lap it up. He placed the bowl near the puppy's nose, hoping the smell of food would rouse it. But the puppy, which Elias had already named Tundra in his mind, a name that resonated with the dog's cold beginnings, didn't move. Elias frowned and looked closer. The puppy's nose twitched, and its nostrils flared slightly, but it showed no inclination to eat. Something is wrong. A hungry animal should leap at food. But Tundra remained still, its small legs folded under its weak body, its round eyes watching the room warily, ears low. Elias let out a slow breath, stroking his silver hair. This was not just exhaustion, it was fear. Something had terrorized this dog to the point of breaking its natural survival instinct. Elias was not a man of words, but he understood animals better than men, having spent years observing and learning their behaviors in the wilderness. This was learned fear, not the mere hesitation of a lost pup, but the innate wariness of an Alaskan Malamute amplified by trauma. His eyes traced Tundra's thin body, over the patches of matted fur, and stopped at the faint scar around its neck. Elias leaned closer, gently parting the fur with his fingers. The scar was thin but distinct, like a cruel memory encircling the soft skin. It wasn't the remnant of an accident but something that had been pulled tight, a collar. His jaw tightened. Someone had put a collar on this dog and, for whatever reason, had taken it off and discarded it in the woods. Questions plagued him. Why? He leaned back, staring into the flames as if they held the answer. He had seen cruelty and knew men regarded animals as disposable inventory, but leaving a puppy to be found by crows or die of cold felt intentional. There was a story here, one he didn't yet know. A strong gust of wind shook the cabin, and a draft of cold air swept across the floor. Elias looked at the window, his thoughts drifting for a moment. The town wasn't far, a short drive. He rarely went unless necessary. His world had shrunk to these walls and the forest outside. But tomorrow, I will check the local general store, see if anyone has heard or posted about a missing puppy. He didn't expect much. Dogs were abandoned all the time. He looked down at Tundra, still tightly curled beneath the coat, eyes half closed with exhaustion. I'll find out tomorrow morning, he murmured. He reached for an old fleece blanket draped over the arm of his chair and gently placed it over the puppy. Don't get attached. This is temporary, he told himself, but deep down, he knew it wasn't. That night, as the storm raged outside, Elias couldn't sleep, listening to the quiet, rhythmic breathing of the small life resting near the hearth. And for some reason he couldn't shake, he felt that this little dog was going to change everything. The morning was crisp, carrying the cold residue of the previous night's storm. The sun finally broke through the heavy winter clouds, casting a pale light over the small town. Elias had barely slept, his mind full of unanswered questions about the small Malamute curled up in an old blanket by the hearth. Tundra had eaten a little early that morning, tentatively nibbling at the soft dry food, but the fatigue in its dark eyes hadn't disappeared. It moved guardedly, seeming to expect something bad to happen at any moment. Elias sighed, putting on his thick wool coat and looking at the puppy. He wasn't a man to coddle animals, but Tundra had moved him. The scar on its neck, the sight of the crows, the initial refusal to eat, it all felt like missing pieces. A change of scenery might help. With some effort, he managed to coax Tundra onto an old leather leash he'd found in a drawer. The puppy was tense at first, its body rigid, but after a few moments, it followed Elias's slow steps without resistance, though its gait was anxious and stiff. Elias recognized that the leash was a familiar sensation, though he wasn't sure if that was good or bad. The town park was not far, a few blocks past the general store. It was a modest space with winding gravel paths, a small, now frozen duck pond, and benches scattered beneath the bare trees. In summer, parents brought their children to play, but in winter, it was quiet, maybe only a couple walking their dogs or an old couple feeding the birds. Elias walked at his usual steady pace, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. Tundra stayed close to his side, its small feet patting lightly on the snow, ears twitching at strange sounds. It didn't pull the leash or wander. It simply looked around with an intense, overly sharp vigilance. As they approached an open bench, Elias noticed a woman standing nearby, watching a boy sitting alone at a wooden picnic table. The woman was tall and slender, with dark brown hair neatly tied back to fall over her shoulder. She wore a thick gray coat, her hands in her pockets, her eyes holding a quiet anxiety. Her name was Sarah. Elias knew her vaguely, seeing her occasionally at the store or the post office, always with a tired but kind face. She was a nurse at the town's small clinic, a single mother raising her son. The boy, Leo, looked about 10, small for his age, with thin blonde hair curling around his pale face. He sat quietly, his hands resting on the table, his concentration focused on a distant point. Unlike other children, he didn't fidget, swing his legs, or show signs of boredom. He just sat, still, immersed in his own world. Elias had heard the rumors. Leo is different, some whispered, autistic, peculiar. But Elias wasn't interested in labels. He only knew the boy was quiet and caused no trouble. Sarah looked up, her eyes meeting Elias's. She nodded politely, a tired smile on her lips. Elias returned the nod, and just as he prepared to walk on, Tundra suddenly stopped, its body rigid for a moment, ears erect, its nose twitching. And to Elias's surprise, the puppy started to move. Not frantically, but with firm concentration and purpose, it pulled the leash, gently but surely, drawing Elias toward the boy. Leo, who had been completely still just moments before, turned his head slightly as Tundra approached. His gaze dropped, fixed firmly on the small Malamute. Without hesitation or awkwardness, Leo slowly slid off the table and knelt on the ground. Elias watched carefully as the boy extended a small, pale hand toward Tundra. The puppy did not flinch or cower as it had before. Instead, it approached cautiously, its cold nose touching the boy's fingertips. The world seemed to stop for a moment. Then, in a soft whisper, Leo spoke, "Friend." Elias felt his chest tighten. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. She took a trembling step forward, seemingly unable to believe what she had heard. Leo had spoken. Sarah swallowed, trying to regain composure. "He hasn't spoken in years," she said softly, her voice a mixture of astonishment and incredulity. "Since he was 4. Elias didn't ask why. There was a burden in her eyes, a sadness and fatigue clinging to her shoulders. There was a painful story, but it was not his to explore. He only knew that something that had silenced Leo for so many years had been broken, at least for a moment, by the mere presence of this small Alaskan Malamute. Alaskan Malamutes are known for their caution around strangers. Tundra still leaned into the boy, letting out a small, satisfied sigh, its tiny body more relaxed than it had been since Elias picked it up. Elias adjusted his hold on the leash, watching Leo gently stroke Tundra's ear. A quiet understanding connected the two. He didn't know what it meant, or why fate had led him to a snowy clearing in the middle of a blizzard, but standing there, watching a boy locked in silence and an abandoned puppy connect, he felt that this was the beginning of something bigger than himself. The next few days after Tundra met Leo passed with a strange stillness that Elias couldn't shake, an uneasy quiet, like the air before a storm. The bond between the boy and Tundra was immediate, something neither Elias nor Sarah could explain. It should have been comforting, but instead, Elias felt a heaviness in his chest. It felt as if something unseen was watching, waiting. He told himself he was being foolish, yet the crows appeared. At first, it was only one, a large black bird perched on the wooden fence outside Elias's cabin, its black eyes staring at the house. Elias had never paid much attention to crows before. He had lived too long in nature to be superstitious. But there was something unsettling about this one. It didn't move, it didn't cry, it didn't hop around like most birds. It just stared. The next morning, there were 2. By the 3rd day, a dozen crows clustered on the bare branches of the trees surrounding the house, their sharp cries echoing in the cold winter air. Tundra noticed them too. It had adapted surprisingly well to life in the cabin, no longer cowering in corners or startling at small sounds. But when it saw the crows, its body stiffened, its ears flattened, and a low, small whimper escaped its throat. Elias had never seen the normally placid Malamute react to birds this way. It wasn't a normal fear. One afternoon, Elias was chopping wood behind the house when he heard the unmistakable crunch of tires on the frozen gravel. He turned, wiping his brow with the back of his glove, and saw a car slowly making its way up the dirt path to his cabin. It was an older, forest green SUV, high mileage but still functional. The driver, a man Elias didn't know, stopped just short of the cabin, scanning the property with his eyes before stepping out. Elias narrowed his eyes. The man was tall and lean, not frail but sharp, with a neatly trimmed beard streaked with gray across a lean face. He wore a heavy black coat, his collar turned up against the cold, and his dark boots left deep prints in the snow. There was an intentional quality to his walk, suggesting a man who made no wasted movements. His pale green eyes, almost colorless, took in everything around him before settling on Elias. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Elias didn't like unannounced strangers, and a quiet alarm was sounding in his mind about this man. "Hello," Elias said bluntly, setting his axe down but maintaining his stance. The man nodded slightly, a gesture that was not quite rude but certainly not friendly. "You live here alone?" he asked, his voice careful, devoid of inflection. Elias didn't answer immediately. He had lived long enough to know that a man asking such a question wasn't just curious. "I manage," he finally said, his voice revealing nothing. The man's gaze passed him, settling on Tundra, who was curled up near the porch. The puppy's body stiffened the moment it saw him, its head dropping slightly, its tail instinctively tucking between its legs. Elias instantly noticed the change in Tundra's demeanor. The puppy didn't growl or bark, not as a dog normally reacts to a stranger, but there was something different in its eyes, recognition and terror. The man tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Nice dog," he said, though there was no warmth in his voice. Elias's fingers twitched inside his gloves. "What are you looking for?" The man's lips closed, as if considering how much to say. "I drive through this area sometimes. Saw a dog like that before, with someone else. Just stopped by to check if it belonged to anyone." Elias disliked the man's way of speaking, too controlled, too rehearsed. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. He looked down at Tundra, still rigid, like a coiled spring. Elias had never seen the Malamute react this way to anyone before. "I found him near the woods a few days ago," Elias finally said. "No collar, no tag. If someone lost him, they're not looking very hard." The man exhaled slowly, his breath visible white in the cold air. "Maybe so." He shifted his attention, now looking at the crows scattered in the trees. "A lot of those birds around here?" Elias followed his gaze. The birds were strangely silent, watching the two men below with black eyes. It was the first time Takashi had acknowledged them, and it unsettled Elias. "They come and go," Elias replied in a neutral voice. The man chuckled softly. "Sure. They do that." He looked at Tundra one last time, reached into his jacket pocket, and pulled out a small white card. "If you hear anything about an owner, give me a call." Elias took the card, though he had no intention of using it. He looked at the name neatly printed on the surface, Marcus Thorne. No company, no title, just a name and a number. Thorne nodded once, got back into his car without another word, and drove away the way he had come, leaving only tire tracks in the snow. Elias stood there for a long time, turning the card over in his fingers. He had devoted most of his life to his own affairs, keeping out of things that didn't concern him. But this was different. He didn't know who Marcus Thorne was or what he truly wanted, but one thing was certain: Tundra had not just been abandoned. Someone had placed it in that forest for a reason. Elias sat at his old wooden table, the dim light from his single lamp casting long shadows on the walls. The card Thorne had given him lay before him, the black text of the name and number stark against the white paper. He had tried for days to shake off the unease that accompanied the man's visit, but the questions remained no matter how many times he tried to ignore them. Tundra had reacted to Thorne with fear, not excitement or curiosity. And the way the crows watched, as if they knew something he didn't. Elias wasn't a man to believe in superstitions, but too many things didn't add up. He sighed heavily, looking at the small figure curled up by the hearth. Tundra was starting to adjust to life in the cabin, but the scars of its past were evident. It rarely barked and didn't cry out for attention. It always kept a respectful distance from strangers, observing and waiting, expecting something bad. It was still too thin, and despite Elias's encouragement, it hesitated over food. The scar on its neck was a constant reminder that someone had tied it up and deemed it worthless. Elias tapped the table with his fingers, making a decision. He wasn't a man to pry, but he had lived his entire life trusting his gut, and his gut was telling him something was wrong. He reached for the old rotary phone on the wall and slowly picked up the receiver. He hesitated for only a second before dialing the number on the card. The line rang twice, and a voice answered. "Hello?" Elias immediately recognized Thorne's voice, calm, uninflected, A practical neutrality that spoke no more than necessary. "Vance," he said concisely. There was a moment of silence on the line, followed by a slight sigh of recognition. "I thought you might call eventually." Elias leaned back in his chair, gripping the receiver. "What do you know about that dog?" Another pause, a length of time that Elias knew was the man deciding how much to reveal. "I might know something." Elias's patience had worn thin years ago. "Then talk." Thorne sighed, and when he spoke again, there was something close to regret in his voice. That dog came from a facility in the West. A large, unlicensed puppy mill, cash-only operation. They deal in volume, not quality. The good ones get sold for high prices, the bad ones, his voice trailed off. Let's just say they don't survive. Elias's jaw tightened. He had heard tales of such places, mass breeding operations that treated dogs as inventory, not living beings. He didn't ask what happened to the ones that couldn't be sold. He already knew the answer. "And you?" Elias asked sharply. "What's your part in it?" Thorne chuckled softly. "You think I run the place?" "No. I was hired to shut it down." Elias frowned, surprised by the unexpected answer. "There are people in this world who don't care about how animals are treated, and there are people who do," Thorne continued. "People with money who don't want to allow that kind of activity. They hired me to clean it up, figure out who runs it, where the money goes, and end it." Elias wasn't sure if he believed him yet, but he let Thorne continue. "It was worse than most places," Thorne said. "Not just for profit, but anything they deemed a hindrance, they eliminated. Too small, too weak, the wrong color, the wrong temperament. Alaskan Malamutes, in particular, were targets if they showed too much early independence or weren't immediately submissive. They had their methods, and they were," he chose his words carefully, "efficient." Elias's stomach clenched. He had seen enough in his life to know what that meant. "I was there the night they were cleaning up," Thorne said. "Some were saved, but not all. Your puppy. It wasn't considered a survivor." Elias looked at Tundra, sleeping by the hearth. "Then how did it end up in my forest?" Thorne exhaled, and for the first time, there was something close to shame in his voice. "They have a system. Anything they don't clean up, they release into the wild, left to fend for itself. Some survive, but most don't. That's why the crows were there." Elias's hands gripped the receiver. He had suspected Tundra was abandoned, but he hadn't realized how intentional it was. "You knew," Elias's voice was low. "You knew they dumped it there." There was silence on the line, a long beat before Thorne finally spoke. "I didn't dump it. I thought it was dead." Elias closed his eyes for a long moment, anger simmering beneath his skin. He wanted to say something, to demand an answer, but there was nothing more to hear. He knew the truth now. Tundra was discarded, left for dead, and the crows, they had learned that when those men came, there was food. They were waiting for Tundra to die, just like the others before it. Elias slowly let out his breath, regaining his composure. He wasn't an emotional man, but the thought of the small puppy, too small and weak to survive, left to die in the cold forest, moved something deep within him. "Why are you telling me this now?" Elias finally asked. Thorne's voice was small. "Because of the way you look at that dog. And the way that dog looked at me. You are the first real home it's ever had." Elias remained silent for a long moment. "Goodbye, Thorne," he said, and hung up the phone. He sat there for a while, staring at the receiver, listening to the faint tick of the clock on the wall. Then he got up, walked over to the hearth, and Tundra stirred at the sound of his footsteps. The puppy blinked, its warm brown eyes meeting Elias's with a quiet, trusting gaze. Elias knelt down and placed a hand on the puppy's thick fur. "You are safe," he whispered. Tundra sighed contentedly, resting its head against Elias's foot. And for the first time since he had picked it up, Elias felt something close to certainty. No one was taking Tundra away. The wind howled through the dense trees surrounding Elias's log cabin, rattling the windows and swirling thin drifts of snow onto the porch. The night was cold, colder than it had been in weeks, and the fire indoors crackled lightly, casting flickering shadows on the wooden walls. Elias sat in his old armchair, an open book on his lap, though he hadn't turned a page in over half an hour. His thoughts were cycling through his conversation with Thorne a few days earlier. The truth of Tundra's past rested on his chest like an unbearable weight. He looked down at the small figure curled up beside the chair, its thick, cream-colored fur rising and falling with regular, strong breaths now. Tundra had found peace here, but Elias knew that peace was fragile. A sudden sound outside put him on edge, the crunch of snow, deliberate and slow. His hands tightened on the book, but he didn't move immediately. Living alone for so many years, he knew the difference between the passing sound of an animal and the cautious footsteps of a man who didn't want to be heard. He leaned forward, putting a hand on the back of his neck. The puppy stirred, raising its head, its ears erect. It had heard it too. Elias stood up, walking with his customary quiet steps to the window. Through the iced-over glass, he could see a dark shadow standing just outside the porch, partially obscured by the tree's shadows. The man wasn't moving, just staring. Even in the dim light, Elias knew exactly who it was. Marcus Thorne. Elias didn't hesitate. He reached for the old hunting rifle propped near the door but didn't aim it right away. He wasn't a violent man, but he wasn't a fool either. He opened the door a crack, and the cold air hit his skin. Tundra stood at his feet, its small body tense, its eyes fixed on the man outside. "What do you want?" Elias's voice was flat, but the sharpness beneath it was clear. Thorne took a slow step forward, his gloved hands in the pockets of his black greatcoat. His face was unreadable, his pale green eyes reflecting the thin light from the house. "Good evening," he said, as if this were a friendly visit. Elias was in no mood for games. "You are trespassing." Thorne sighed softly, tilting his head. "I came to finish a job." His gaze dropped to Tundra, and though his face was mild, something cold glinted in his expression. "That dog. It shouldn't be here." Elias felt Tundra press against his leg, but the puppy didn't budge. Instead, a low, warning growl rumbled in its throat. It was the first time Elias had heard such a sound from the Malamute, which was known for its reluctance to bark. "I didn't ask for your opinion," Elias said, gripping the rifle. "He's with me." Thorne took another step, lowering his voice. "That's a mistake." Elias didn't move or blink. "The only mistake standing in front of me right now is you." For the first time, Thorne's neutral expression cracked slightly, his lips thinning, his jaw tightening. "You don't understand what you're getting involved in," he said. "This isn't a stray you picked up. When people start asking questions, when they look too deep, you might draw unwanted attention." Elias understood Thorne's meaning without explanation. If the truth of Tundra's past was revealed, it would expose not only the cruelty but also those who had permitted it. And Thorne, even if he claimed to be the one shutting it down, was somehow deeply involved. "I have no interest in your problems," Elias said. "Tundra is no longer your concern." Thorne's expression darkened, and his voice turned cold. "I can't allow you to keep it." Elias saw the change in his posture, shoulders squaring, the muscles in his fingers briefly tightening. It was the stance of a man who took what he wanted, by any means. Before Elias could react, Tundra moved. The Malamute puppy, now stronger, suddenly darted forward in an explosion of energy, positioning its body between Elias and Thorne. A furious bark and snarl ripped through the night, unlike the hesitant sounds from before. The small body faced the man, its eyes burning with a defiance Elias had never seen. Thorne was surprised by the sudden aggression and froze. "Call him off," he said sharply. Elias didn't move. "I don't think I want to." Tundra's barks echoed in the night, loud and relentless, the small body refusing to retreat. It was in a defensive stance, guarding, and there was no fear left. It knew this man, remembered him, and was no longer afraid. Behind them, the front door opened. Sarah stepped onto the porch, her breath white in the cold air, clutching her cell phone. "The police are coming," she said in a flat voice, the tension thick in the air. "You should leave." Thorne's jaw was clenched for a long moment. He didn't move. Slowly, he took a step back, his gaze flickering between Tundra and Elias, his expression once again unreadable. "This is not over," he murmured. Elias didn't reply. He watched Thorne turn and walk toward his car, which was parked down the hidden path. As Thorne disappeared into the darkness, Tundra let out a satisfied breath and turned back to Elias. Elias knelt, stroking the puppy's head. "Well done, boy," he whispered. Tundra whined softly, leaning into him. In the distance, the faint wail of police sirens cut through the cold air. Sarah approached, holding her phone, her gaze moving from Elias to Tundra. "What happened?" Elias exhaled, looking at the dark trees where Thorne had vanished. "A man who made a mistake," he said. And he just realized it. The police would arrive soon, and Elias would tell them what was necessary. But for now, he looked down at Tundra, sitting protectively at his feet, and felt something settle in his chest. This small Alaskan Malamute puppy, once huddled in the snow for dead, had just stood up to the man who left it there and won. Elias leaned down and scratched behind Tundra's ears. "You really are home now, Tundra?" Tundra sighed contentedly, its tail giving a light thump on the porch, and for the first time, Elias felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The first true signs of spring arrived quietly, creeping under the heavy blanket of winter that had enclosed the town for so long. The thick snow covering the ground thinned, patches of damp earth appearing, and the first buds began to swell on the trees that had been bare for months. The wind no longer howled like a beast through the forest, but carried the chirping of distant birds, announcing their return. The change was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Elias felt it all. He stood on the porch, hands in the pockets of his old coat, watching Tundra bound across the softening snow in the yard. The dog had changed. It was no longer the fragile, frightened creature he had picked up in the forest. Its cream-colored, thick fur was healthy and glistened in the sun. The ribs, which had been so evident when Elias brought him home, were now hidden beneath muscle, and its body was solid. But more than its physical appearance, its spirit had changed. Tundra no longer hesitated or cowered in corners, expecting to be struck. It ran, played, chased shadows, and sniffed with curiosity, its tail wagging with a calm confidence that had once been lost. Behind him, the sound of a car broke the silence. He turned and saw Sarah stepping out. Her long brown hair was loosely braided over her shoulder, and her face was flushed in the cool morning air. Dressed in a simple sweater and jeans, she carried a relaxed look that hadn't been there when he first met her. The burdens that had tied her down were beginning to melt, and Elias knew the reason why. Leo climbed out of the passenger seat, gripping the straps of his backpack with small hands, looking around. His thin blonde hair was longer, curling at the ends, and the pale blue eyes that had once looked so distant now held something new, attention. He immediately spotted Tundra and, without hesitation, walked toward the dog and knelt. Tundra, now healthy and solid, approached with quiet joy, pushing its large head into Leo's hands and sighing contentedly. The boy giggled, burying his face in Tundra's thick fur. Sarah's expression softened as she watched them. Leo had changed, too. The boy who had lived in silence now spoke often, not frequently, but enough to let the world know he was present. He still had his days when he retreated, when the world's weight became too much to bear, but Tundra was his anchor, the bond that connected him to reality. The Malamute rarely left his side when he visited, curling up on the floor, following him as he explored Elias's workshop, and nudging his hand with its nose whenever he drifted too far into thought. Sarah walked onto the porch, pulling her coat closed, and gave Elias a small smile. "He's been talking about coming here all morning," she said, nodding toward her son, who was laughing as Tundra chased a stray leaf in the yard. "He likes it here." Elias snorted, crossing his arms. "Well, the dog has a habit of stealing my gloves, so I suppose he's comfortable." Sarah chuckled, leaning against the railing for a moment. They watched Leo and Tundra play in silence. After a pause, she spoke softly. "Thank you, Elias." Elias looked at her, raising his eyebrows. "For what?" Sarah exhaled, looking at her son. "For all of it. For taking Tundra in, for welcoming Leo here. He's changed. In a good way. I was so afraid for so long. That he would never come back. That he would remain locked away forever. But Tundra," she stopped, shaking her head. "He did what I couldn't." Elias didn't say anything at first. He wasn't good at emotional conversations or the kind of man to dwell on feelings. But he understood what she meant. He had been alone for years, his heart closed, believing there was nothing left for him in the world. And then, one winter morning, he found a small Malamute puppy left for dead in the forest, and everything changed. He cleared his throat, shifting his weight. "Well, I suppose we both needed something to wake us up." Sarah smiled at that. Leo ran up to them, his breath a small white cloud. "Lake. Tundra. Go," he said, small and certain. Elias raised an eyebrow. "Is that what he said?" Leo nodded seriously, looking at Tundra, who wagged its tail in anticipation. Elias sighed, shaking his head. "I can't refuse that request." Together, they walked down the familiar path toward the lake. Tundra ran happily by their side. The trees above them whispered, the remnants of winter fading as movement began. Elias didn't know what the future held, if Thorn would return, or what scars of Tundra's past still lurked in the darkness. But for now, none of that mattered. Tundra was safe. Tundra was home.